Hello and welcome to this broadcast by Brexit Watch. I'm your host, Jonathan Saxty. Today we are delighted to welcome the noted psephologist and polling expert, Professor Sir John Curtice. Sir John is a professor at the University of Strathclyde and widely cited in the broadcast and print media. Sir John, welcome to Brexit Watch.
Nice to be here.
John, before we get into the nitty-gritty of the discussion, firstly, like to wish you and your family well at this time. How has the crisis and subsequent lockdown affected you and your family and your work?
Well, I mean, my wife and I are both of a certain age. We're into our mid-60s, so we're having to be relatively careful. There are two sides to that. In one respect, the answer to your question has not made a great deal of difference because both my wife and I are long used to working from home, one of the glories of the internet. And if you spend most of your time writing and researching, is that this is something you tend to do on your own anyway. And in my case, I've long since practiced working from home and going into the office one day a week, which I think might become the new normal.
It may.
That said, one obvious change is that I have spent most of my time in the last 3 years researching Brexit, public reactions to Brexit and the electoral consequences of Brexit, including 2 general elections. The news agenda, of course, is now moved away from being absolutely preoccupied with that to being focused on coronavirus. So the phone rings much less. I am being interrupted much less, and I'm doing much less in the way of media performances and appearances. Now, that said, like everybody else, one's agenda move on, and yes, I'm beginning to think about research on the impact of the pandemic. Here, my interest is on the possible long-term consequence on political attitudes and values. And I've been reading some of the primarily social psychological literature on the impact of pandemics, which is out there, which we might want to come back to. So it might open up a new agenda. So life is quieter, but I guess once Brexit was done, life was going to be quieter anyway. And I was certainly hoping to catch up on quite a lot of outstanding writing, and I've still got plenty to keep me preoccupied.
I know the feeling. Now, it's amazing. It's interesting you mentioned that because it's incredible to think that just a few months ago, Brexit was all anyone could talk about. So if we go back to perhaps go back in time, lay some groundwork. When we think about Brexit and both the debate running up to the referendum, the debate during the referendum around that time, and subsequently right up until the last few months, was that debate about left versus right, or was it about something else?
No, it was not a debate about left and right. But obviously we need to define what we're talking about here. By left versus right, what I mean is, are you on the one hand somebody who thinks that there's too much inequality in our society and that a major preoccupation of government should be intervening in the economy, spending on public services in order to try to reduce that inequality and manage the economy? On the other hand, if you're on the right, you're somebody who says, look, primarily at the end of the day, economic growth and well-being is created by entrepreneurs. We need to create an environment in which they feel able to take risks and will get the rewards for doing so. And that if the role of government is to provide an environment to allow that creativity to foster, from which in the end, all of us will benefit. And that's the kind of classic division between left and right. Now, during the Brexit debate, we were not arguing about how big or small the state should be. Is Britain too or less an equal society? That was not the principal preoccupation. The principal preoccupations were, of course, sovereignty, immigration, and what were thought to be the economic consequences of otherwise of changing our relationship with the European Union. Now, this primarily tapped into a different set of values we've long known to exist. You can describe it variously. One is social liberal versus social conservative, the other is libertarian versus authoritarian. But it's essentially a division between those who, on the one hand, who say, look, at the end of the day, what social mores you follow, what moral code you follow, what language you speak, what religion you follow, if any, what sexual practices you engage in, etc., etc., what moral choices you make. These are things that are essentially for the individual. On the other hand, there are those who would say, no, look, actually, if you're going to maintain an adequate degree of social cohesion in society, then actually society does to some degree need to impose a moral code. It does need to ensure that there is adequate social order. And so that distinction between social liberals and social conservatives has always been with us, but that was primarily the value that divided people into Brexiteers versus Remainers. And it so happens that on British Social Attitudes, which I helped to direct, we've long every year been asking survey questions, which on the one hand identify whether you are left or right, as I have defined it, and on the other hand also identifies whether you're libertarian or authoritarian, as I define it. And if you go to the 2016 British Social Attitudes Survey and you look at the relationship between where people stand in response to these questions and how they voted in the referendum, you will discover that there is basically no difference between those on the left and those on the right, so far as whether they voted Remain or Leave. In contrast, around 70% of social conservatives voted to Leave, and around 70% of social liberals voted to Remain. And that was essentially what the division was about. Now, one of the reasons, therefore, why Brexit has proved so difficult for both the Conservatives and the Labour Party, creating such internal tensions, is that they are parties that at the end of the day are primarily organised and orientated around the argument between left and right. And yes, to some degree, the Conservative Party tends to be somewhat more socially conservative, the Labour Party tends to be somewhat more social liberal, and that indeed is reflected to some degree in their electoral basis. But above all, their votes are structured by whether people are on the left or on the right. But whether or not you are a social conservative or a social liberal is, in the general public, utterly unrelated to whether you're on the left or on the right. As we say, technically, it's orthogonal. It's something that completely cuts across. So when we started focusing on Brexit as the centre of our political debate, this inevitably was much more difficult for both the Conservatives and Labour Party to handle, because it cut across both of their existing electoral coalitions, as well as indeed at a much more elite level. So this was an unfamiliar territory. It was not what our politics was usually about, but by the time we got to the 2019 election, was in fact about what our politics was about, electorally, at least as much as the argument between left and right, because Brexit has refashioned the character of the support for both the Conservatives and for the Labour Party.
Could you speak a bit more to that? How has it refashioned them, and is that likely to continue given the crisis we're currently in?
Well, it's two ways in which you can see the refashioning. One is simply to track the character of support for the parties according to whether people voted Remain or Leave in 2016, and we can track this from 2015 onwards. So let's take the Conservative Party in the first instance. Back in 2015, around 45% of those people who went on to vote Leave voted for the Conservatives, and around 30% of those who went on to vote Remain voted for the Conservatives. So it was roughly the Conservative vote was roughly of the order of 3-2 Leave to Remain. By the time you get to the 2019 election, the Conservative Party was getting the support of nearly 3/4 of those who voted Leave, and only around 20% of those who voted Remain. So when this happened in 2017, it then got pushed further in 2019. So you're now looking at a party whose electoral support is roughly of the order of almost 4 Leavers to 1 Remainers. This is very, very different. So ironically, the electorate that gave David Cameron the majority that paved the way for the referendum to happen in 2016 is a very different electorate from the one that in 2019 gave Boris Johnson the majority he needed to get Brexit done. And in the case of the Labour Party, the change is not as dramatic, but it is also clearly there. So back in 2015, we're looking at a party which had a ratio of around 2-to-1, Remainers to Leavers. It was still, at that stage, very clearly, principally a party that's getting the support of Remainers. By the time you get to 2019, the Labour Party was getting just under 50% of the Remain vote, maybe not 15% of the Leave vote. So again, its vote clearly much more become concentrated on the Remain side. So that's what it is. Now, you can look at by white social conservatives now at least as strongly correlated with how you voted as to whether you're on the left or on the right. And of course, what's also associated with relatively low levels of educational attainment, and because educational attainment tends to be correlated with social class, this has also helped to attenuate the relationship between social class and vote. Certainly in terms of the bivariate level, there's no longer much relationship. You can begin to see it once you control for a few elections. But the Conservative Party no longer has anything like as predominant middle class vote as it once did. The Labour Party no longer has anything like working class voters. Again, makes this an most clearly illustrated in the fact that London has become, go back 20, 25 years, and London tended to follow the country as a whole. And meanwhile, the Labour Party is in trouble in many parts of the north of England. And that's where the geography illustrates the change. Now, even before coronavirus, we were, of course, asking ourselves the question, well, once Brexit is done, to what extent will this division remain? Now, I don't know. What we can lay out a few possibilities. One is certainly we need that people, we now have lots of people who think of themselves as either a Remainer or a Leaver. We have about 40% of the public saying they're a very strong Remainer or Leaver. In contrast, around 10% of the public are very strong Conservative, Labour or whatever. We've got but not seen for our political party since the 1960s. And that's not something that necessarily goes away soon. Quite a lot of going to be arguing about which is certainly going to carry on fueling the socially conservative versus social liberal dimension. On the other hand, it may well be that Brexit is done. It proves at least not to be unsuccessful. Let's put it that way. And that as a result, in the end of the day, those on the Remain side accept that that's what we're doing. We developed some modus vivendi via the European Union everybody's reasonably happy with, and therefore the issue dies, and maybe we go back to traditional class politics. And the truth is, none of us knows where this is going to play out. As far as coronavirus is concerned, well, it's something that has aspects of both dimensions. So on the one hand, one of the things that we know about pandemics, according to the literature, is that it makes people more concerned that people should conform to social norms, and can make them rather more socially conservative. It is illustrated by the fact that now if you see people congregating, more than 2 or 3 people together, and it looks as though households are mixing, well, you'd start a Twitter storm and a probium about, well, hang on, what are these people doing, etc., etc. And that is the way in which a pandemic starts to mean that we start to want to enforce social codes. It also raises concerns about immigration because we go, hang on, we need to control our borders. So to that extent, at least, coronavirus undoubtedly is partly about the social liberal versus social conservative dimension. And there is a debate going on. There are those of a more liberal persuasion who are saying, look, the answer to the coronavirus is it shows that we need international collaboration. This is a worldwide problem. We're going to have international collaboration to solve it. Oh, and by the way, it's pretty silly to be trying to break all ties within that context. The other side of the argument says, look, what's happened at the end of the day, the solution to coronavirus has happened within the nation state. They're the ones who are having to pick up the tabs. They're the ones who are having to control it. And yes, one of the instruments that's so crucial to that is controlling our borders. So our sense of national identity and citizenship has been reinforced. So that's one aspect. That said, as we've seen begin to emerge, now we're beginning to think about how we get out of the lockdown, we're beginning to see some of the differences between left and right emerge. Public health and health behavior itself has always been something where those of the left and those of the right have had somewhat different perspectives. If you're on the right, you're rather more likely to think of health as being an individual responsibility, and that it's up to you to stop smoking, to diet, to get your weight down, and to think about, what are reasonable risks that you're willing to take. If you're on the left, you say, look, actually, people's health behavior is determined by their circumstances, and people in more difficult circumstances are less likely to engage in behaviors that are healthy. And by the way, in a pandemic, the decisions we take as individuals not only have implications for us as individuals, but also collectively for society. So that's one way in which the left-right debate is now beginning to emerge as we talk about what do we do as we get out of lockdown. And of course, also the argument that perhaps some sections of our society, those in some occupations who can't work at home, which are disproportionately working class occupations, are perhaps more at risk from the pandemic than those of us who can work at home, who are in relatively safe, secure middle class jobs. So there is a left-right class aspect to this also. Now, which of these two things are going to be more important, I think it's very, very difficult to tell. But coronavirus is, I think, going to tap into both those debates. And so far as the academic literature is concerned, we certainly know that it tends to encourage a socially conservative outlook, certainly according to what is often quite a lot of experimental evidence that social psychologists have engaged in.
Wow, that's really interesting. A lot to unpack there. I think the question that naturally leads from that is there any data at the moment on the public attitude towards the government's response? What does the public tend to think about how the government has responded thus far?
Yeah, there's quite a lot. I mean, one of the things that most of the polling and survey work that's been done about coronavirus so far has been about how are people behaving, and how well do they think the government's been handling things, and it's been very, very, very much the focus. So I guess there are three headlines. One is in terms of the overall performance of the government, people are inclined to say it's been handling things well, although most polling organisations will now say to you that mood is less strong than it was 3 or 4 weeks ago, but it's still a widespread mood. And that probably underlying that in part, there is a wish, irrespective of your political view, there is, as it were, a wish, we hope to God that the government will succeed, that the pandemic will be controlled. Oh, and by the way, along the way, some scientists will either discover some therapeutic or treatments or a vaccine so that we can all get out of this. So there's that rally to the flag effect. That said, second headline is that when you start asking people about particular aspects of how the pandemic is being handled, they are pretty critical about PPE. They're pretty critical about testing. They are, however, seemingly grateful for the fact the government has intervened to try to stop unemployment with the furloughing schemes, etc. So at detailed level, well, the more of a mixed picture. And then the third thing I think we know is that indeed the public are, at the moment at least, more concerned about the health risks than they are about the economic risks, and that there seems to be quite widespread reluctance to get out of lockdown anytime soon. Yes, they're more true of somewhat more of some groups than others. Some younger men, perhaps, this is less true, and that does therefore mean that certainly the initial reaction to the government's attempts to reduce the lockdown in England has met, shall we say, with something of a mixed response, and half of people said they approved and half people said they disapproved. Now, that of course may change over time as the government gradually succeeds in persuading people, but certainly I think, as it were, now that we're getting to the stage where the government's having to make potentially difficult decisions, and decisions which are now becoming the subject of political controversy in the way they haven't been so far, the government's task of persuading the public and keeping the public on side at least looks as though it's at risk of looking somewhat more difficult than it has done so far.
And how has the recent, bit under the radar, as it were, considering everything that has happened, how has the recent election of Sir Keir Starmer as the new leader of the Labour Party, how may that impact things, do you think?
Well, I mean, the short answer to is that Keir Starmer is not a terribly well-known politician, and that most members of the public had very little idea of who he was. And of course, insofar as the Labour leadership campaign might have provided something of a platform for him to become better known, he got somewhat curtailed because lockdown overclouded the second half. Now, there's not peculiar to Keir Starmer. The same could be said of Lisa Nandy and of Rebecca Lawn-Bailey. In fact, Sir Keir was slightly better known than either of his two opponents. So he's very, very much an unknown quantity. So far, what one can say is that insofar as people are willing to say whether they approve or disapprove of him, rather more people say they approve than say they disapprove. And certainly in contrast to Jeremy Corbyn, if you ask him, can you imagine being Prime Minister? If people respond to the question, they kind of say they can. So he starts off at least with a relatively clean sheet, not too bad perception, but of course he does, given the dominance of the government on the airways in the pandemic, it's been a question of how does he get to be better known. Now, I think, beyond that, what can one say? I think the upsides and downsides. It's very clear that Keir Starmer's strength comes from his experience as a lawyer. He is clearly somebody who is good at grasping a brief, at grasping the detail, and posing questions. And we've already seen this in his performances in the House of Commons. And of course, because the atmosphere of the House of Commons has been completely transformed into one which is much more like the silence of a courtroom than the bear pit that the House of Commons usually is.
Yeah.
In that circumstance, that is an asset. And the fact that Boris Johnson is not somebody who is known for his command of detail, as opposed to his way with words, begins to be something of a disadvantage. That said, I think what Sir Keir has to learn is also to be able to paint in bright, vivid colours, so that his words come alive, and above all, people begin to have a sense of what Labour Party is about. And I think on that, he unlike Boris Johnson, he doesn't immediately come across as a charismatic character. He comes across as a serious character, but as we would say in Scotland, somewhat dour. And that he's going to have to lighten up and brighten up along the way. But I think certainly, Jeremy Corbyn had many strengths, and I'm probably not as critical of him as many people would be. But clearly, certainly as an opposition leader, Sir Keir's inquisitorial style is one that means he will potentially pose more of a challenge to government. And I think, so far, he has been playing this line of, I support the government, I want the government to succeed. I think the interesting thing has been in the last, is that more recently, really since Boris Johnson's speech on Sunday, in which he tried to open up the lockdown, Sir Keir started to move away, he started to break the consensus, he's begun to take that risk, and we'll be waiting to see what happens. That said, insofar as lots of people are piling in and say it's all Jeremy Corbyn's fault that the Labour Party is so unpopular, and that once they change their leader, all will change. Well, at the moment, at least in the current context, the Labour Party is still only winning about 33% in the polls. Probably not least, by the way, and here one has to bear in mind, Brexit may have gone to quiet in the agenda, but it is still very, very heavily structuring People's Party support. And, so far, at least, therefore, the Labour Party is really only able to appeal to the Remain half of the public, and it isn't able to appeal to the main half of the public as well as the Conservative Party's the Leave half. So to that extent, at least, recovery is not necessarily going to be that easy or straightforward for the Labour Party.
That leads us nicely back to the Brexit issue. Now, obviously, that is, as you say, humming away in the background, was dominating the headlines for a long time, seems to have been given a backseat, but it's still there. And of course, the transition negotiations are still going on, led by David Frost on the UK side, Michel Barnier on the EU side. Now, as things stand, the UK is due to leave on the 31st of December this year. The government are adamant that is going to happen. But there have been calls, of course, the SNP, for example, to extend transition, something Downing Street have been adamant they will not countenance. What does the polling suggest about the public attitude to this, if anything?
Depends a little bit on how you ask it, but let's start from the headline. The headline is that a majority of people think that we should delay the end of transition. However, if we look underneath the bonnet, we can see two things. One is, unsurprisingly, most Remain voters say we should extend the transition. 70-75% of them will say that, depending a little bit on how you ask the poll question. But the honest truth is that probably many of those would have said that we should be extending the transition anyway, because they're not really in favour of the principle. I mean, very few people have changed their minds about the merits of Brexit. We are still absolutely divided 50-50. And even now that we're out, we still seem to be divided 50-50 on the principle. On the Leave side, most of the polling that's asked so far has found Leave voters divided fairly evenly, but in the end, somewhat more of them saying, no, we shouldn't extend, and equally more Conservative supporters saying we shouldn't extend. So insofar as one would say that at the end of the day that the government's principal constituency is not the electorate as whole, it is Leave voters, because it's Leave voters that got Boris Johnson his majority, then, as it were, even that polling suggests that it's not obvious that extending the transition would necessarily be electorally easy for the government. One polling company, however, so far, I mean, most of that polling has been about, given coronavirus, should we extend? One exercise now, however, has just simply said to people, it was at the back of a survey that was about coronavirus, but didn't say, look, given coronavirus, should we extend? It simply said to people, should we extend or not? With that, then the Remain Leave divide became even clearer. And with that, most clearly, Remain voters said we should extend. And here, the majority amongst Leave voters to say that we shouldn't extend was much clearer. So stop mentioning coronavirus, and Leave voters certainly don't want to extend. So it depends a bit on how you ask the question.
Right.
It looks as though, there's probably a minority of Leave voters who go, yeah, maybe we should.
Right.
Probably the case that the majority of Leave voters certainly would prefer not to have to do so.
Right.
But given the Leave voters only constitute half the country, it only requires a minority of Leave voters to take the opposite view before you can argue that a majority of the public are in favour of extending the transition.
But of course, this could all change if the message from the media changes. You made the point about at the moment the health preoccupation is overriding the economic preoccupation. I mean, do you think this, if there is a bit of a mood towards extending transition, do you think that is likely to change in the subsequent months going into the summer?
I think all that one can say to is that the polling evidence suggests that if the Prime Minister were minded to change his mind, and all the signals so far are very, very determinedly, seemingly, that that's not what the UK wants to do, that he will actually have to persuade people. In other words, Leave voters would need to be convinced that this really, really did need doing, and he would have to frame an argument in such a way that they felt that this was indeed the case. And shall we say, so far at least, the government's not been doing anything to prepare the Leave electorate to possibly contemplate that that might be the position. Now, of course, there are those on the Remain side who argue, say, well, look what happened to the deal that the government eventually got. In the end, the government ended up agreeing to something that perhaps we all thought the government would never agree to, vis-a-vis Northern Ireland. Well, of course, actually what's been agreed in Northern Ireland is currently the subject of dispute between the UK and the European Union. And in any event, that was something that enabled Boris Johnson to pave the way to getting Brexit done. And having the deal made that look much more possible, and it made it much more attractive to Leave voters. It certainly helped us quash the challenge from the Brexit Party. I think the difficulty on this is, I think shifting on this issue would be more of a difficult pivot than it was over what happened in Ireland. But we will have to wait and see as to where the government goes on this. But at the moment, all the rules, and of course, there are those on the Remain side who will argue, well, maybe actually the government wants to be quite happy for us to leave at the end of December with coronavirus still being a problem, because all the problems can be blamed on coronavirus rather than being ascribed to Brexit, and that therefore this is actually not necessarily unhelpful for the government if indeed Brexit should prove to be more difficult than those on the Leave side argue that it would be.
What if the European Union asks for an extension in June?
Well, it might, but the UK government is telling us that it won't. Now, I suppose if you are being Machiavellian, the UK government might want to require such a request as a possible point of leverage, and to say, yeah, okay, but by the way, we're not paying anything into the budget during this extension period. And by the way, we're not talking about fishing for a while. We'll just maintain the status quo. I might even say, yeah, look, we're not going to keep 20 new ECJ regulations if any of them come. They might want to play hardball, but it depends on the extent to which you think the European Union are going to be sufficiently concerned about this to actually want to do it. And of course, this is where, again, Remainers and Leavers don't agree. Remainers will say at the end of the day, look, as compared with dealing with coronavirus and maintaining the integrity of the single market, dealing with the United Kingdom is a second order priority. We might be quite a big economy, but we're not as big as the single market. Those on the Leave side will say that, actually we are this world's, 6th, 7th biggest economy in the European Union, cannot afford to have a good relationship with us. That's a debate that goes on between the two sides, and eventually we'll discover which of those two arguments is correct.
And of course, all economic bets could be off because of this virus. I mean, things could be radically different in a few months' time. And one could argue that the European Union hasn't exactly covered itself in glory, considering the coronavirus debacle.
Yeah, I mean, sure. I mean, there is no doubt, as we were saying earlier, that one of the clear implications of the coronavirus has been how the nation state has been to the fore, and that's true within the European Union as opposed to outside the European Union. But of course, in part, that's occurred for exactly the same reason as to why we've now got divergence within the United Kingdom about how to manage the lockdown, because most of what is to do with management of the lockdown is a devolved issue, all right? And the truth is that health is, for the most part, not an EU competence, all right? And to that extent, therefore, the European Union has limited remit. That said, of course, what the crisis has done is it's exposed once again one of those arguments inside the European Union that was also there around the financial crash, which was the extent to which the European Union should be willing to share financial risk at the European Union level, as opposed to the nation state level by issuing, EU-wide backed bonds, etc. Now that was an issue with the financial crash. It's also clear, and this is clearly one of the ways in which, whether you're for or against the EU, there are plenty of people who will argue that having a single currency without the ability to issue debt and to manage debt around it does leave you in an exposed position. So yeah, absolutely. And of course, ironically, freedom of movement across the European Union has taken a bit of a toll. Many a EU country has effectively closed its borders, despite the Schengen Agreement, at least officially closed their borders. So yeah, this has not been an easy thing for the European Union to deal with, partly because it doesn't have the right competencies, partly, yes, it exposed a continuing argument because different countries have different views about how the European Union should manage the economic consequences of A, the financial crash, and B, the pandemic.
Before we go back to the domestic issues for a second, just to stay with the EU, how do you think the current crisis may affect the debate between the federalists on the one hand and those on the other who minded not to go with the federalist model? And in fact, those people in the EU who are suggesting if we don't have common debt issuance, for example, we could threaten the whole integrity of the European Union.
The understanding, Jonathan, is that one of the crucial things to realise that will happen in the wake of this coronavirus is that many people will draw from it implications that are consistent with views they had before any of us ever heard the word of coronavirus. Okay. We will be inclined to interpret the world in such a way that is consistent with our existing predispositions. So sure, if you are somebody who believes in EU integration and that the European Union needs to become an even more powerful institution than it is at the moment, you will say, and this goes to show the need for international collaboration. The European Union needs to be willing to act more collaboratively economically, etc., etc. All right. Equally, if you're somebody who is of the opposite disposition, you will go to show, well, this just goes to show that in the end of the day, it doesn't work. At the end of the day, that it's the nation state what's crucial, and that people's national citizenship and identity is what matters. And that's one of the reasons that, by the way, at the end of the day, we should not necessarily expect the coronavirus to necessarily result in a dramatic change in attitudes towards some issues of public policy. And that certainly so far, we've not got much evidence because all the polling's been crowded out by coronavirus. But insofar as we've got the odd reading of people's attitudes towards being in or out of the European Union or rejoining versus staying done since coronavirus as opposed to beforehand, they do not suggest that there's been any significant change of attitude so far. And we're still divided 50-50 as a result.
Right. Yeah, I understand that, the confirmation bias factor.
Yeah.
Now, we were speaking a moment ago about Boris Johnson and how expedient it would be for the Conservative government to delay the end of transition. If one was being a cynic, one could argue that the Conservatives obviously got a thumping majority in December. They're in power until 2024. Between now and then, yes, there are obviously local elections next year. One assumes the London mayoral election, but there are very little opportunities for the public to kind of voice their opposition to the government. And of course, sometimes, other events can take hold. So, because of all of that, could the Conservatives potentially, could it be expedient for them to delay transition? Could they make the case, well, we have this crisis. It was unforeseen. Its ramifications are huge. We just have to do it. It won't go on too long, but we just have to extend for another 6 or 12 months? Would it be expedient for them to do?
Well, two answers to that. First is the answer to that question depends on your view as to whether what the government wishes to call an Australian-style relationship with the European Union is one that you do or do not think will be economically advantageous to the United Kingdom. I mean, there are those inside the Leave side of the argument who feel that that would be perfectly fine and have long been saying, let's just trade on WTO terms, all right? That said, what is true is that if we're going to go down that path, I mean, one issue that doesn't seem to have been much discussed so far is that presumably means there's rather a lot of customs officers that we will need to have at our ports by the end of December, and et cetera, and whether or not the government's going to have the ability to, as it were, operationally deliver our side of a WTO relationship is certainly not something that I've seen a great deal of discussion about as yet. But so, you know, the truth is, if the government believes what it says, and it believes, well, I guess at the moment it's saying there will be a deal, that we're not negotiating for no deal, but at the other day, presumably, it must believe that it's happy to deliver on Australian-style terms. It said that before, and if that's what it believes, then why should it need to do anything, right? Now, if in the end that isn't its position, in the end it feels we do need to have an agreement, and indeed, even if you think it's the European Union's fault that we've not managed to reach an agreement, but in the end we need one. Well, the second issue that has to bear in mind, you're right, the government does have to 2024, and maybe if Brexit's delivered by 2022, that's fine. But we do have to remember that the authority of any Prime Minister does rest on their perceived ability to deliver electoral success. And we are talking about a Conservative parliamentary party which has quite a lot of MPs who are representing constituencies who are not used to having Conservative MPs, yeah, and Conservative MPs who are not used to having to defend seats that were not historically theirs.
Yeah.
And certainly, you know, assuming we are able to hold elections next year, there will be a very large midterm election in May of next year. It's not just London; it will be district councils, the county councils, Scotland, Wales, etc. Pretty much the whole of the United Kingdom will actually have a vote now because of the delay of this year's elections in May. And the truth is that, you know, if the public have fallen out of love with this government, maybe nothing to do with Brexit, maybe in the end we get a second spike and the government is blamed. And the Labour Party persuades people that actually Boris Johnson is a buffoon who doesn't know what he's doing, then in those circumstances the party could suffer seriously. Well, at that point, you know, the Prime Minister's authority is going to be a lot weaker. And lots of Tory MPs are going, hang on, looks as though I might have to find another job in 2024. And these things can affect governments quite early on if they get into early electoral, particularly under the scenario I've painted. You come to the view that, like the ERM crisis, or not the ERM crisis, the Black Wednesday of September 1992, it's a perception that proves to be indelible. All right, so it's not temporary difficulty, it's this government fouled up. Now, we're not in that world and we may never get in that world, but so to that extent, at least, in those circumstances, a Prime Minister who had lost his political authority, a Conservative Party that was worried about getting the electorate back, in those circumstances, not having delivered Brexit and therefore having provided a reason for the Leave Conservative electorate to remain loyal to the party would be much more of a risk than if the government is thought to have dealt with the pandemic effectively. So effectively, there's bound to be an interaction between these two things.
And just one final question on the EU, considering obviously the huge economic hit that's been felt in Britain, in Europe, across the world, is there a case for suggesting that the EU won't want to play hardball, and the UK may not want to play hardball because the economic consequences of coronavirus have already been tremendous, so they wouldn't want to add to that? or perhaps, like you said, Schengen has been, a lot of the red tape of the EU has quietly been shelved. Perhaps the so-called cliff edge, if there was to be one, wouldn't be quite the cliff edge now after coronavirus.
Maybe not. I mean, who knows? I mean, it's pretty clear where the points of dispute are. And they're not real. I mean, both sides, as it were, would prefer to have a reasonably close trading relationship. The arguments are about, one, maintaining the integrity of the single market, and therefore the extent to which we are or are not going to want to fall out of the European regulations. Two, the issue of state aid, and whether or not we are at risk of doing what the EU regard as being too much of a risk. And it's also pretty clear that Northern Ireland is still not resolved. And I mean, herein lies a difficulty. At the end of the day, because the European Union, and this has always been true throughout, because the European Union is an organization of 27 states, all of which you've got to keep on board, it has much less in the way of flexibility. At the end of the day, once it's laid down the rules, it has to follow the rules. And that throughout the whole Brexit process has tended to come against the British culture of, well, look, we don't really have a constitution. We make up the rules as we go along, and we change them to adapt to circumstances. Yeah. Right? Which, however, is fine for an individual country that has a particular culture, but is much more, it's not the way in which the European Union operates, either culturally, legally, and frankly can do so politically. So the European Union, there are certain areas where it's pretty clear the European Union thinks it's in its interest and to maintain the integrity of the single market, where some things really do have to be sorted out with the UK. Thereafter, it probably is after a close trading relationship. And the problem is that for the UK, some of those things touch on the notion of sovereignty that it thinks it has acquired and is on which it is reluctant to compromise. And I think almost ironically now, what's probably true, the debate's moved away from immigration, as where both sides have accepted that the UK is not going to maintain freedom of movement, though how much freedom of movement there will be is still to be negotiated, or what the rules will be. But that the issue now is sovereignty, and the European Union is wanting to maintain its sovereignty over its single market, and the UK is wanting to maintain its sovereignty over its own jurisdiction. And we know that issues of sovereignty are much more difficult to resolve than are issues of trade. Trade can be made into a positive sum game. Issues of sovereignty tend to be zero-sum games.
Going back to the current coronavirus crisis again, just for a moment, I saw one poll which suggested around only 9% of people, I think it was a YouGov poll for the RSA, only 9% of people wanted things to go back to the way they were before after the crisis. And of course, we don't know. You mentioned the second wave. We don't know if that's likely. The indication from Asia is that is quite likely. We've seen the news today from South Korea. What do you think the polling suggests about public sentiment for change after this? I know you spoke earlier, but is there anything we could perhaps look forward, perhaps in the next year, 2 years, that may impact the wider political and economic landscape? Just green shoots right now.
There have been a couple of polling exercises. One you've just cited, another one from Keck's CNC, in which people have been said, asked a question along the lines of, do you want things just to return as they were? Do you want them to change in some way? Trouble is, when you then go on further that polling and ask people, well, what do you want changed, or in what way do you want it changed? There's no consensus. Right. And the truth is that some people are simply telling you about things they disliked about Britain before the coronavirus, and of course they're hoping it will change, all right? The interesting, the interesting question, I think, is to what extent does coronavirus change the public's expectations of what it thinks the government should do? What is the role of government?
Yeah, yeah.
And I think there are three issues here. One we've already briefly mentioned, which is to do with, one of the things that's, leaving aside our arguments about immigration, one of the things that's been interesting about British society in the last 20, 30 years is we've tended to become much more socially liberal, right? Much more willing to allow, to embrace diversity, etc. Now, if indeed pandemic makes us much more concerned about morality and conformity, etc., will some of that be reversed? Will we become somewhat more socially conservative as a society? Second area where clearly, as we've already said there's going to be a debate about globalization. How did coronavirus spread? Because we live in a globalized world. What have we had to do in order to try to control it? To shut globalization down. But then what do you draw from that? Does the public look to actually to see tighter controls on immigration? They reject international collaboration, or do the opposite? That's the second area. And both of those, the evidence from previous pandemics is that it's not unreasonable to anticipate that maybe we will go in a somewhat more socially conservative anti-globalization section. The area where I think we don't know what will happen, we don't have any clues at all, as it were, is the relationship between the government and the economy.
Okay.
I've certainly not found any literature that has got into whether or not the pandemic changes people's views about whether the government should be intervening more in the economy or not, should we have a bigger state or not. And that's not surprising, an obvious connection. But of course, what we have seen is a dramatic intervention.
Yeah.
Now, it's a Conservative government, though in truth it was never a neoliberal government. This was, Thatcherism is dead inside the Conservative Party before coronavirus. But it's an unprecedented level of intervention, even greater than the intervention that was forced on the Labour government in 2008, 2009. And one theory, so-called thermostatic theory, says that basically what happens is that if the government increases public spending, the public reacts. So one of the things, for example, we've been seeing people reacted to Thatcherism by increasingly wanting more public spending. And then when the Labour Party turned on the tax at the beginning of the 21st century, they reacted against and said, oh, God, please reduce our taxes, public services now fine. More recently, we've now seen people begin to react against austerity, slowly but gradually, and we've been moving back in the opposite direction. But so that's the kind of thermostatic reaction. We kind of react against the current movements in public spending. The interesting question here is whether or not that thermostat, rather than simply still being set at 98.4 Fahrenheit, has got reset to, let's say, 102, all right? i.e. we want more. We're willing for the government to act in a more feverish, more hotter atmosphere or not. One area where I think certainly in particular one might anticipate that's true, and again, where we again got another piece of social science theory which pushes this in a different direction, is that we do know that there's some evidence that both an increase in the aggregate level of unemployment and personal experience of unemployment tends to make people rather more sympathetic towards welfare benefits for those of working age. And one of the striking things about the financial crash is that actually the government's wish to try to reduce welfare spending on those of working age was largely being endorsed by the public, perhaps because in fact unemployment didn't go up much in the wake of 2008, 2009. Now, if unemployment does go up in the wake of this, and it looks more likely to do so, even with the government's best efforts with the furloughing scheme, we may discover that, and there are already signs of this happening anyway, that a society which has been saying money for pensioners, fine, money for anybody else, as little as possible, will change its view, and that we become much more sympathetic to the provision of welfare, and in that area at least the public may want more. They of course probably also will want more spending on the health service. That would not be unlikely. So I think this I think, this is in a sense the first time that we've had a public health crisis that's required a major government intervention inside the UK, and the extent to which this changes or doesn't change attitudes is highly unknown. And we can think of our existing evidence potentially points us in both directions, but I think this is the interesting territory to watch, and in part it will depend on the arguments of politicians. And there are clearly those on the left who are wanting to say, and interestingly, some on the right as well. I mean, both the left and the right are wanting to say, well, we last had this during the Second World War, and we're all getting together. And again, well, of course, then people say, well, and what happened afterwards? Well, we wanted the government to permanently carry on doing more. And that framing of the crisis and the analogies for the Second World War is arguably something that will potentially be advantageous to the left, because the left will certainly want to try to frame this as evidence that we need to spend more. The interesting thing in question, however, is that many of those on the right now also seem to be accepting that argument, and maybe therefore as a result the Conservative Party will be able to embrace that mood in a way that perhaps Churchill wasn't able to do so.
John, I'm conscious of time, so my final question to you is, drawing all of this together and all the data that you've looked at and others have looked at, if there was one prediction, one forecast that you had, just one, it could be on the economy, society, political parties, anything you like, one consequence, one forecast prediction you would make generally because of this crisis, what would it be?
I think we are going to have a debate about how we manage the public services in a way that is commensurate with an effective economy. And that in particular, I suspect we're going to have a debate about whether or not some aspects of the public services need deliberately to be run less efficiently than was true in the past. In other words, that having spare capacity for the state may actually be essential to being able to run an effective economy, because in effect, we have had to shut down the economy because of concerns about the capacity of the health service. And now we're moving on to we're having still to keep the economy under control, because we've not managed to come up with it, because we have a social care system that has proven to struggle to cope with the coronavirus, and where we do not have a public health system of tracking and tracing that enables us to actually be able to manage the virus. Now, that obviously there are things the government's trying to move on, but that implies a willingness perhaps to have the state spending more money on things that means you have more spare beds than you otherwise would. We've been spending a lot of time trying to make the public services efficient. I think we may need to redefine what we mean by efficient, one, and two, social care has obviously long been a problem, particularly in England, but even north of the border where the regime is different. The government said it was going to do something about it. The parties on both sides have been bickering about it. I think all sides on this argument are going to find themselves impelled to think much more carefully about how we both finance and deliver social care in future, because it's clearly been shown to be a relatively fragile operation at the moment. And I suspect that's the other debate that we're going to have.
That seems like a good point to end. So thank you very much, John Curtice, for your time today. I'm sure our viewers will really appreciate that. And thank you for watching. You can find out more www.brexit-watch.org. You can also find us on Twitter and on Facebook. See you soon.
Bye-bye.